Welcome to the Word Weaver podcast, a literary place in cyberspace where I share tangible tips, tricks, and words of wisdom to help you achieve your dream of writing a book. I'm your host, Louise Johnson, a writer and the author of Behind the Red Door. Let's dive into today's chapter. Welcome back to the Word Weaver podcast. In today's episode, we have Bryn Turnbull. She is the internationally best-selling author of 4 historical fiction novels, The Woman Before Wallace, The Last Grand Duchess, The Paris Deception, and the soon-to-launch Berlin Apartment. She holds a Master of Letters in Creative Writing from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, a Master of Professional Communications from Toronto Metropolitan University, and a bachelor's degree in English literature from McGill University in Montreal. Bryn focuses on finding stories of women lost within the cracks of the historical record. And I'm very proud to call Bryn not only a brilliant author, but also a dear friend. Before we dive into the next episode, a quick word from today's sponsor.
Hi, I'm Lale Arakoglu, host of Women Who Travel. Each story from our guests and listeners is totally unique and utterly personal. We love hearing about your first impressions when visiting someplace new.
My first trip to the Patagonia region was on the Argentine side. I couldn't believe the expansive territory. It's like being in Tibet. The emptiness and the harshness really, I found transformative.
Or a story told when safely back on dry land.
You know, things happened every single day. I ran out of gas on a jet ski in the middle of the ocean. And I was like, what if a sea creature comes to eat me? But then I'm delusional. I was like, I'll make friends with it and it won't eat me. And maybe I'll ride that back to shore.
That's how it works.
Yeah.
Join me, Lale Arakoglu, every week for more adventures on Women Who Travel, wherever you listen to your podcasts.
So, Bryn, welcome to the Word Weaver podcast, our most returning guest.
Glad to be back. It's been a minute.
It has. Well, the podcast was on hiatus for 3 years, so I feel like it's kind of the new evolution of the Word Weaver, and there's no one else I'd rather have on the podcast, especially. I feel very honored that we get you in the week leading up to the launch of your number 4 historical fiction novel. I'm so excited. How are you feeling leading up to launch? Is it still the same frenzied anticipation as with every novel?
You know, it feels, it's not quite as like scary as the first novel because it's like, I know what's going on. I know kind of more or less what I'm doing, but there's still always that sort of anticipation, right? Like you're sending your heart out into the world and you're like, I really hope people don't stomp on it.
That is very true. How do you plan to celebrate? I know you're doing a launch. So for anybody who's in Toronto, how can they celebrate with you on August 27th when the book finally drops?
Yes. So on August 27th, we are getting together at Type Books on Queen Street in Toronto, just across from Trinity Bellwoods Park. I'm going to be chatting with the wonderful Bianca Marais, a really fantastic best-selling author.
Love her.
And yeah, we're going to ring in the Berlin Apartment. So it should be really fun. If you're there, if you're free, would love to see you.
Yay. And if not, everyone, you need to pre-order the book right now. I've already had mine on pre-order list. I'm so excited for everyone to read it. I've read some little kind of snippets here and there, but basically you've brought us readers, historical fiction fans, from Great Berlin to Imperial Russia to Nazi-occupied France, and now we get to experience through your voice Berlin, Germany during the Cold War, which technically, is this your most contemporary historical fiction period yet?
Yeah, it is. And I mean, it was kind of funny because like academically, you know it, but like in the course of writing, I was like, wait a minute, the wall came down in my lifetime. Like it's not so much historical fiction, right? Like this is lived history. Which so it was a very different thing to write. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like we said, it's set during a very dramatic point in history, the division of Berlin in 1961. And then it didn't come
Mhm.
down until actually we were born, not to date us, 89.
I know. Yeah.
Um,
89. Didn't know, but we were living through history then.
I know, we had no idea. But what inspired you to write about this specific point in history, given all the other books that you've written?
Yeah, so there were a couple of different sort of influences that went into kind of inspiring this story. One of them, it kind of spun out a little bit from my previous book, the Paris Deception, where I had two young characters. They were German by birth, grew up there, realized they did not want to be part of the Nazi war machine, and they end up leaving to Paris. And, of course, the war catches up with them there.
Yeah.
But while I was developing their characters, I was really struck by what it must have been like to grow up in Germany in the 1940s. And how does that, how would that impact your psyche? And
Hmm.
so in this book, I wanted to kind of look at what happened to those kids in 1961, right? Like by the time we hit 1961, Germany's divided,
Yeah.
but the scars from the war are still very much there. And so, how does that shape them? And then, how does the geopolitical context of this divided city, this uncomfortable butting together of capitalist West and communist East,
Hmm.
how does that all kind of impact who you are? How does it impact your life choices? And how does it shape the person you become?
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I really like how you always write kind of from the civilian's point of view too, of what it was actually like. You get into the head of what it was like to actually live there. And I think for me too, one of your novels, I would say one of the biggest strength is how you blend the historical accuracy with the emotional depth of those
Thank
characters.
you.
That is truly, I bow down. It's not an easy feat to do. And I'm curious, how do you strike that balance when you start researching of being faithful to history, but also having a engaging character-driven story at the same time?
It's always a question in the back of my head
Hmm.
because I think that as a historical fiction author, you do have a sense of responsibility to portray history as accurately as you can. And yes, of course, storylines, plot lines, like it is fiction at the end of the day. But I never want to write a book and have a reader come away with an inaccurate representation of what that time and place was. Particularly if I'm writing like, real lived historical people, I don't want them to be, committing a crime they didn't commit or, completely misrepresenting who they were.
Right.
I think that there's a power that we wield as historical fiction authors. And we have to make sure that we're wielding that responsibly because we are contributing to we're contributing to the historical discourse in a very meaningful way for people who maybe aren't going to go and read through the bibliographies and watch all the documentaries and go through kind of the mountains of research.
Right.
If we're that conduit, we have to kind of show our work.
Oh, that's so beautifully said. And I think it's something readers don't always think about when they're picking up historical fiction. But that's an interesting point now that I think of all of your books. I mean, your first book, The Woman Before Wallace, you have a real Wallace Simpson, real characters. And then fast
Hmm.
forward to the Berlin apartment, we meet Lise and Uli, who are fictionalized characters.
Yes.
So that's actually an interesting where you had to stay really tight to historical fact with Wallace Simpson, but here you get to play a little bit more, and we meet Lisa and Uli at the beginning. I think it's right in the days before the barbed wire fence in Berlin goes up, 1961,
Yes.
and there's a love story. I don't want to give too much away. They are recently engaged. So how did you come up with these characters, and then how did you develop their relationship knowing there would be such a physical divide separating them?
So with these characters, one of the, in the pandemic days, not that I like to think of the pandemic days, but I, of course, like everybody, what could we do with our time? We walked, right? Like, I don't know about you. I walked the length and breadth of Toronto listening to podcasts.
Oh, 100%.
And one of the podcasts that I listened to is called Intrigue Tunnel 29. And it is about one of the historic tunnels that was dug underneath Berlin between East and West Germany. And NBC actually filmed, they got permission to film this escape that happened under Berlin. Yeah. So there's an NBC documentary, you can look it up. And so I remember I was listening to this. I'm walking through like Summerhill, just seeing this story playing out in my head. And so I knew I wanted to write about Berlin. I knew I wanted a tunnel, and I knew I wanted this couple at either ends of it.
I love that visual cinematography of a
Yeah.
tunnel and two people on opposite ends divided by.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I like to do, one of the things that I always say I like to do is find the stories of women caught in the lost to the historical record.
Mm-hmm.
And while Lisa and Uli are fictional, real people did this. This was not an anomaly. There were many, many tunnels that were dug. There were many escape routes that were made to reunite couples just like Lisa and Uli, and families that had been separated.
Everyone's going to love reading about this because there's actually like it's not just like, oh, unrequited love. There's actually physical, geopolitical reasons keeping them apart. And I believe there a lot of people got married so that they could escape. Is that true?
You could do that in the days before the wall went up.
Right.
But once the wall went up, it was very, very difficult to get across it because, when East Germany built the Berlin Wall, when they first put it up, they positioned it as an anti-fascist protection barrier. And the positioning of it was to keep evil capitalists out of East Germany.
Right.
In reality, it was to keep the East German population in because so many East Germans were leaving by way of Berlin specifically into West Berlin and then onto a plane and into the West.
Right.
That there was a serious drain on their economic capacity.
Mm-hmm.
And their production capacity because there was just this drain happening. And so what it was intended to do is to keep people in.
Yeah.
So, these couples, these people who get separated, you could say, yes, I'm engaged to, Uli across the wall, but it would be very hard to figure out who you could apply to for some kind of visa or a license. They kept that very hidden because they didn't want you to leave.
Right.
They wanted you to stay and contribute to the East German economy.
And it's fascinating to me even that it started with a barbed wire fence. It technically wasn't even a wall at the beginning. And then it became the symbol of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall is, I think, the most visual symbol of the entire Cold War.
Well, it is. And I think one of the reasons for that is Berlin in the 1950s, 1960s, it was a microcosm for what was playing out on the broader geopolitical scale. Berlin is this little city, 100 kilometers in East Germany. The city itself was divided. And it was really where we see the Cold War playing out on the smallest possible scale, right? The Iron Curtain's in your backyard.
How much research does go into creating a detailed setting like this? I mean, do you start with going to the library, going to archives? Do you watch movies, listen to podcasts? What was the research process in particular for the Berlin apartment like?
It was very involved because this is a period of history that I am not as familiar with. I mean, like so many readers, I've read so much about the Second World War.
Yeah.
And then I put it down and I'm like, what was happening in San Francisco in 1964? Right? Like that's the next area that I'm interested in. And so I kind of didn't know too much beyond the fact that the wall was there. I traveled to Berlin a number of years ago. I did the tunnel tour. That was super interesting to me.
Oh, that's fascinating. I'd love to do that.
Oh, yeah. Really, really cool. If you get a chance, do it. For this book, it was a lot of in the library, in the archives, research. This book, because there was such like a physical element to it, like this is not really a spoiler, but they're digging a tunnel.
Right. The tunnels, yeah. Subplot.
The tunnel happens. Yeah, spoiler, there is a tunnel. But you kind of have to really go into like, okay, what is the soil composition in this particular part of Berlin? How far down is the water table? How far down do the foundations of buildings from the First World War go? Would they be there? All of that stuff is also stuff that you really have to like consider when you're doing something kind of, when you're giving your characters like a heist moment. You
Right.
have to plan the whole thing out in your head just the same way that they would, or else it's not going to be convincing. So that's
Right.
always a tricky bit, which I really enjoy.
If you look at the Google history searches of historical fiction authors, it'd be the most
Straight to
fascinating.
jail.
You straight to, yeah, exactly. Yes,
How can you dispose of a body in, wherever and whenever? Like we are on watch lists, honestly.
100%. I remember even for the Paris Deception, the research process, again, for all of your novels is so involved, but I liked how you had to even, because the Paris Deception is about art forgery, and you had to go into when was oil paint invented and how would they have actually forged a painting during this
Yep.
time in Nazi-occupied France. So was there any interesting tidbits? That book also takes us to Champagne, France, so you got to write about that. Was there anything that really kind of tickled your historical fiction fancy or delighted you while writing this book that you got to include? Or fun
I mean,
facts?
yeah, I wouldn't say that it tickled my fancy, but it certainly scratched the historical itch, right?
Yeah.
The historical research itch. And it was all the research that I did into the Stasi and into, the surveillance state in East Berlin, and just how pervasive the Stasi was in East German lives. They had this thing. So the whole thing with the Stasi was if they had to resort to physical violence, they'd already failed, right? They wanted to convince you to stay. And they would do it with these very, very insidious tactics where, it was called decomposition.
Okay.
And if you were like considered a target of the state, it would start with like, the occasional little conversation with somebody that you know and trust about, what are your thoughts on
Psychological
East
warfare
Germany?
first.
It's gaslighting.
Right.
And yeah, so it starts with that. And then it goes into, maybe your production numbers at work are not as good as they should be. And you're questioning about whether you actually, put out the output that you thought that you did. And then you go home and everything is exactly as you left it. But the brand of tea in your cupboard is not the brand of tea that you thought you bought.
This is real gaslighting
Yeah. And so you start to really question
reality.
your reality, right? Like you start to question your own memories. And basically, the idea was if we get you so paranoid and questioning your own sanity, you're not going to have time to plot against the state, right?
Right. That is fascinating. I didn't know any of that.
Yeah,
That would,
it's very creepy. And when they ended up opening the Stasi record offices in the
mhm.
1990s, like when the wall came down, that was the first thing that was one of the first things that Germany wanted was to open the Stasi record agencies. And the level of informant, like the degree to which people were informing on each other
Yeah.
was unprecedented. Like marriages broke up because people would find out that their husband of 20 years had
Wow.
been informing on them to the Stasi that whole time.
Wow, they get the people closest to you to inform on you. I mean, that you have
Hmm.
the level of betrayal and trust. That's a theme running through, I would say, without giving anything away, this book
Hmm.
as well, is who do you trust? How do you know who to trust? Can you trust yourself to
Hmm.
like make that right decision? So I think readers are going to be really, really, as with any of your books, but just the layers of kind of self-awareness and involvement in this book beyond the surface level kind of historical fiction. I'm really excited. So you
Thank
also
you.
started, I believe, a podcast called Context with Bryn Turnbull, which I think is genius as an accompaniment to this book to give more detail because you read the book and there's just so many like rich details and history. So how did that come about and how did you decide to do a podcast about it? I think is a really smart idea of you.
Oh, thank you. Well, I mean, you were one of the inspirations. You were like one
Oh,
of the best podcasters, honestly.
oh, thank
I
you.
love what you do. I've always loved your podcast.
Thank
Um,
you. I'll take the compliment, but no.
it's
I
true.
listened
Yeah.
to the first episode and the music, everything, so high quality production. You
Thank
record it
you.
with one of your friends who's also the producer. Everyone should go listen to Context with Bryn Turnbull. I will leave it in
Thank
the show
you.
notes and subscribe.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Yes, the wonderful Josh Nemi. It's as much his brainchild as mine. But yeah, the idea was because it's a period of history that people may not have an immediate familiarity with, we wanted to kind of give that grounding. so that if you are walking into the historical context of the book blind and you don't want and you want to walk in kind of and let the book surprise you, that's awesome. But if you want to walk in and have that sort of little extra grounding, that's the intention of the podcast, is to help give you that a little extra grounding. Yeah.
That's so smart. Also, after you've read it, you can listen to it before and get context, but I also think after you've read it, it'd be great for book clubs who kind of want to go
Hmm.
back in and get more. It's just, I think it's such a smart idea, especially with historical fiction authors, because of the level of research and questions, and it's just a fascinating period.
I think all authors in some respect, like we're all those kids who want the straight A a little bit, you
The
know?
gold star, yeah.
We all want the gold star. And so with this book, it's like I want to show my work. I don't just want it to like be in my head. I want to put it somewhere.
I use the metaphor of you spend all this time creating a gourmet meal and then people devour it in 5 minutes. You spend all this time researching, creating this world, these characters, and then, I mean, people devour it in a couple days or however long it takes you to read this book. But there's so much more behind it. So I think I really like that, especially for the author. It's selfish for us even to have the podcast like context so you can keep all of that research and stuff that's in your brain alive and have some place to house it. I think,
Exactly.
yeah, I really like that because it is always so sad. Like when you move on to the next book, you miss those characters in that time period.
Do you find that your characters leave you when you've finished the book? Like, do you put it aside and you're like, that's it, that character's done talking to me?
Never. Elizabeth Arden, I wrote that book so long ago, and I still to this day will have, I mean, part of that book with Elizabeth Arden is I had actual diary entries to her. I said in the book because I didn't want to
So
spiral
cool.
into madness writing to an inanimate object. So I would kind of write these journal entries to a real person, to Liz. So I still have all those journals like stacked up on my bookshelf, and I don't write to her anymore. I'm in a different period, but I always think of like what would Liz do or how would she handle this? And even her birthday, I think of her and celebrate her. But what about you, all of your characters?
Oh yeah, no, there's a growing cocktail party in my head of characters who
I love
seem
that.
to want to chime in on my life and my fashion choices and X, Y, and Z.
Well, here's the question for you. If you could spend one day with any of your historical
Ooh,
fiction characters, who would it be and why?
that's so tough.
That
Talma
is
Furness for my first book, the woman who's the mistress to the Prince of Wales. I would want to hang out with her because I would want to be invited to like a Fort Belvedere country party. I think that that would just be so fascinating. With the Romanovs, I'd want to see sort of the vanished world that they lived in.
true.
So they'd be fun to hang out with. Fabienne from the Paris Deception, she just would be fun, I think.
Yeah.
She'd just be a fun, ridiculous, outrageous person. And then in this book, I've got Inga, who is Lisa's best friend. She's Swedish. She's a student at the Free University as well. She gets involved in this tunnel project alongside Uli, and the story kind of takes her off in a way that she wasn't expecting. And she is like silver tongued, ultra charming, like smooth talker. It would be fun to hang out with her.
Everyone
So
look out
yeah,
for Inga in the Berlin apartment then.
it's so funny. I find there's in every single book there's a secondary character who kind of like shoves their way into the main action in a way that I hadn't expected them to. Honestly, characters have a mind of their own.
It is crazy. And that's why they never leave us. I mean, they just weasel their way in and they're always there. They're usually fiery and feisty. I always like secondary characters too.
They're
Yeah.
so fun. And I mean, I think one of the things I love about secondary characters is they don't know that they're secondary.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
Like they have to have main character energy as well because in their head they are the main character. They're living their own life. They're living their own story at the
I
same
feel like
time.
that's like a meta. I gotta channel that. I'm a secondary character, but I have to have main character energy.
What are you talking about? You've got main character energy.
Well, so do you. You have to have main character energy, I guess, in your own life, but in the greater grand scheme I feel like a secondary character. There's so many other amazing, especially in the literary world. Of all four of your novels, I know you can't pick a favorite child, but which one was the most fun for you to write now that you have four under your belt? And which one would you say maybe was a little bit more challenging or was a tougher push to the finish line?
Mm. The most fun to write in terms of like adventure that I got to do while I was writing the book, absolutely the Paris Deception. I was kicking around France for a little while. I got to go and tour conservation labs at all these incredible museums. So that was really, really fun and rewarding.
Yeah.
And that was a book I would say that like I'm most proud of in a way
Yeah.
because the research is so heavy, and that was like 6 years of my life was like researching that book.
Yeah.
So I'd say like that holds a special place in my heart for sure. This one was really tough.
Hmm.
It was very tough to write in a lot of ways, not least of which it was a fast deadline. So the pace of the book was like a lot different.
What was the turnaround like? I mean, for your first book, the one before Wallace, you have the freedom to write as much as, and then as soon as you get a publishing deal and a book contract, it's like you said, it's a quicker hit to the deadline. So did that
Mhm.
kind of make it harder?
It did. It did. And this was my fourth book in 5 years. So it's been a busy sort of cycle to be on.
Mhm.
And with this
Very
book,
impressive too.
oh, thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
But this book had me questioning whether I was going to keep writing at certain points,
Really?
whether, oh yeah, 100%, because it was like,
Mm, no.
it's tough to do. It's tough when you're on a deadline. And then, looking at sort of the risk reward side of being an author, it's not easy. It's not easy to make it work. It's not always easy to make a livelihood at it. And
No.
so for a while I was writing this book, I was like, I don't know that I'm going to keep doing it. And that was a really tough, it was definitely, there were some dark nights of the soul in writing this. And it's also my first love story, like my first, like true connected love story. Like my
Yeah.
other books all had women, it was the relationship between women. It was more of like the sisterhood bond.
Yeah.
And with this one, it's a romantic bond. And so that was a very different thing to write tonally.
Oh, everything you just said there, I want to dissect because I think it's something I think about a lot too. But historical fiction in particular, what you write is actually, I hope readers know how challenging it truly is because you're writing about history. You're also kind of a psychological thriller in a sense. You're propelling, especially, I mean, the Paris Deception, art forgery in this one, the tunnel building. There's a
Yeah.
psychological thrilling element to it.
This
There's
one this one is a thrill. This one's a psychological thriller for
it's,
sure.
right, psychological thriller and also romance. You have every genre encapsulated in historical fiction. So to sit down and write is I would say a lot more challenging. You also have the beast of the research before you. You can't just sit down and kind of make it up out of your head and add things. Like you said, you're trying to stay as true to historical fact. So I just want to say kudos to you for you make it look easy as a reader from the outside looking in. It's always
Thank you.
fascinating to hear that you had these dark nights of the soul. And I think it's important to say that. And I really think other readers and writers, there's a comfort in knowing that you're not alone in those hard times. So how did you keep going? What do you have any mantras or rituals? Like what propels you, other than the deadline, to kind of no, I'm a good writer. I am talented. I have something to say. Like what is it that keeps you doing this?
I mean, the support of friends and family who, kind of like are there cheering you on. I think that that's important to have your community,
Hmm.
whether it is family or whether it's other authors, whether it's, reader friends or readers that you haven't even met. The number of times I've gotten an email like on my website from somebody who I've never met, and they've taken the time to reach out and say that my book touched them in a way. I don't I don't think that they realize how valuable that is,
Yeah.
particularly to an author who is questioning whether like she's going to keep going,
Right.
right?
And
That
they would
is
have no idea.
huge.
They just think, oh, Bryn Turnbull, internationally best-selling author. She probably gets these kinds of comments all the time.
No, no, more times than not, it's someone saying, your book was nice, but you missed one little historical detail on page 224. And so it ruined it for me, 1 star.
I will never
And
get
you're like,
over you told there was
oh,
the invention of Scotch tape email that you got from a reader.
I did. I got an email from a reader telling me that I was off on the invention of Scotch tape by like a month. Oops. And I was like, I know, but it was wrapping a Christmas present, and I figured that it would be okay to just shift it by 1 month because otherwise, then this character is going to have to glue a present together, and then that's going to be stand out more for the reader.
It's so funny.
Anyway,
But in that sense, I actually think that's kind of a love letter because they took the time to write you. They're so
yeah.
tuned to every detail in your book. I mean, that's pretty impressive. I actually have a kind words folder for those rainy, sad days where emails like that, or
Oh, that's brilliant.
I screenshot it and I'll just drop it on my computer. And when I'm having a really tough day, I'll look at that again and say, okay, somebody out there, a stranger, this touched them. And if I'm writing just for them, then that's all that matters. And I just kind of have to remind myself of that.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah,
I need to do that, the kind words folder.
do
Yeah.
it.
I think the other thing is like there is sort of like a sick compulsion that we all have as writers. I would be writing anyway. I think I would go crazy if I wasn't writing because whether or not it's getting down on the page, all of these characters are still going to be in my head. And all of these stories are still going to be in my head, right?
Yeah. That's the
Yeah.
love of writing. You would go crazy without having that outlet.
Yeah, 100%.
There's the whole book talk funnel, Bookstagram. Is this the new wave? Is this where, even if my interests aren't exactly there, is this where you're supposed to go? So it can get even really tough in the publishing world of like, is what I'm writing, does anybody care? Or is it just
Is
me that
anybody
cares about
care?
this? Yeah.
100%. Because like you can write something and so the Paris Deception, for example, that is my best book, I think. Like
Oh, they're all amazing. I love
artistically.
that one particularly
Well,
though too. Thomas
thank you.
Crown
Yeah, I mean,
Affair.
yeah, but I'm astounded that was my least that's been my least successful book.
That's so
And it
interesting.
just baffles me that, and who knows why that's the case. Like, because on paper, I'm like, this is my best book.
Right.
But
Technically, and the
technically,
research wise and everything for you, and it felt the best for you. Yeah.
yeah. And so it's funny to kind of look at it and be like, what is it in the industry? And I think it's hard. I think it's hard for publishers to say with any great confidence what's going to sell because they don't have the crystal ball either.
No.
But I think so much of what publishing is right now is it's risk averse. And
Mm,
so instead of looking for, in a lot of respects, instead of just saying, okay, what's the next great thing? And this book is great,
yeah.
they're saying, well, we want the next Colleen Hoover.
Yeah.
And instead of saying, well, this person isn't Colleen Hoover, but their book could do better than that if publishers were to get behind it.
Right. Right. No, I completely agree. I even remember kind of during the pandemic, everyone saying, oh, book sales are up, people are reading more. This is like well-meaning friends and family. This must be so great for you sales-wise.
Mm,
People are buying books again. And I said, well, actually, I mean, debut authors aside, people are buying the same kind of top five authors that are pushed. It's way harder, I would argue, to get discovered nowadays of
yeah.
if you're writing anything kind of a little bit differently or a little bit outside of what is hot and sexy on kind of book talk or whatever, or your people are just buying the same authors that they always know. But bringing it back to your career, I actually think that is a huge asset for you because you have now these four amazing books. The covers are gorgeous. The titles are pick that up off the shelf, especially the Berlin apartment. I love like when you have the city, the Paris Deception in it. These are
Hmm.
really sexy titles, and people know, like I said in the beginning, of like what to expect. Your novels have both the historical accuracy and emotional depth. which is very hard to do.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're never allowed to quit. You have to keep writing books forever and ever. And
Oh, I
I kind
plan
of want,
to.
you are currently sitting, if you're watching the YouTube episode, you can see a little sneak peek of Bryn's stunning cottage where she writes, surrounded by nature. Tell us a little bit about your writing process, where you like to write, and what's a typical day like for you?
So for me, this is my favorite place to write. We've got a cottage up in the Great Lakes, and it's the nicest place to write, honestly. I think I'm one of those people, like I get distracted very easily. And so when I write in the city, I can't write at my in my home because I'm like it's too boring. I need to go out and be at a coffee shop and be here and to go there and then I'm gonna shop and whatever. Like so my writing day is a lot more split up in the city. Whereas up here,
Hmm.
it's gorgeous, but you don't have that same level of like activity.
Yeah.
So I find I can dive a lot deeper into the process in a way that I find a lot more difficult to do in the city. So in the summer in particular, because our place is not it's not winterized.
Hmm.
So to be able to come up here for like 4 months of the year, I try to kind of keep that time as as protected as I can because I know that this is where I get my best writing done.
Oh, that's so cool. And so do you wake up
Mhm.
there and start writing right away? Do you go for a swim in the lake? What does that day look like, even though it's a little bit slower than kind of the hectic pace of the city?
Yeah, I still get up and I'm at my desk early. I write best in the morning, I find. So I'm like, okay, just get up and get to the desk and go. Tea is my drink of choice when I'm writing. I've
Yeah.
always got a cup of tea on the go.
With sugar?
And depends. Sometimes sugar, sometimes honey, sometimes just milk. Right now it's a just milk time because I've already had two teas with honey in it, and I'm like, I'm just going to be buzzing like a little hummingbird if I have any more
Yeah.
sugar.
It's better than all the coffee I drink. Don't worry.
So I start my day, I'll write like as much as I can in the morning until my brain feels like full.
Yeah.
And then I'll usually get up, I'll go for a swim or a sail or whatever kind of like midday activity I can fit in. And then I'll come back and I'll work on like outlines and I'll work a little bit more on like structure.
Hmm.
Because right now I've got two books going at once. So I
Oh,
try
I
to do like it.
can't even imagine.
Yeah. Yeah. The second book crept up a little bit. I wasn't planning on writing it so much this summer, but it's like kind of got in my head and it's got a hold right now. So I was like,
Shiny
okay,
object syndrome. You got hit with
total
shiny
shiny object
object
syndrome,
syndrome.
complete shiny object syndrome. So I'm kind of like, okay, if I do the morning and I do like the writing for book five, and then the afternoon is outlining book six, it's kind of my writing day at the moment.
I love hearing that. So you are
Mhm.
an outliner. You are not a pantser right by the seat of your pants. You have kind of a
No,
full plotted, you know where you're going.
the first sort of like process for any of my books, I see it as a movie
Mm.
in my head. And so the first thing that I'll do is I'll write out that movie in like five, six, seven paragraphs, just the entire plot line. And then I'll start fleshing it out once I've got kind of the main points down.
Hmm.
And once I've got kind of like the fleshed out, okay, this is like the movie treatment of the book, then I'll start breaking it down into chapters and scenes and conversations. And
Oh,
that's the point. Like I do that all on an Excel spreadsheet. And that's the point where like the characters will start, like their voices will start taking shape. And
okay.
that's usually like I'm developing the characters at the same time as I'm like breaking out the detailed outline.
Yeah.
And then once I've got all that, that's when I go into the full writing. And
Mm,
at that point, it's nice
interesting.
because like even if you've got a day of writer's block or
Hmm.
you're not really feeling it, you have a roadmap to work from.
Yeah.
So even if it's not like 100% exactly what you want to say, you're still going to put one foot in front of the other and get pages out that you can go back and revise, but at least they're there.
Yeah, that's so smart. I don't know how people do it without that roadmap. I would sit down at
You're a
my
plotter
desk
too, aren't you?
100%. And then I'm same with you, the
Yeah.
Excel spreadsheet. But I love hearing this whole creative writing craft of how you process and how you start, because it's interesting that you said you kind of the dialogue comes to you. And that's why it's so
It
easy.
comes
Like
very quickly.
That's
Yeah.
fascinating. That's one of the trickier things I would say it comes maybe last for me.
Really?
Yeah, more I'm cinematic like you the way I think of it. And I kind of go more into the setting, create the world building,
Yeah.
then the characters, and then like I have their voices in the head, but the actual snippets of dialogue, I think that's really cool that you put that in your Excel right away.
Yeah. Yeah. It'll just sort of like I'll get into a groove and then the dialogue will start coming. Yeah, it's kind of a funny process.
And you actually are the person who got me onto Scrivener, which is a writing
Yes.
software. You do not need it. Anyone out there, if you're a writer, you can use Google Docs, Word document, but Scrivener is really fun and addicting. It's pretty bare bones. It actually it seems more like it has a lot of bells and whistles and a little more intimidating than I think it is. But how
It's
do
got a lot of
you
bells and whistles I don't use.
yeah, I think that's what it is. There's so many little things you can do, but I use it as a very bare bones way to house all of my notes, my research, and then I like the little cue cards that you have on Scrivener to do the
Yeah,
chapters. But I'm curious because I think you also write longhand, which is a dying art, I would say. And if there's
I
something,
know. I
the way you
agree.
described your setting at the cottage of kind of the slower pace of life, do you find you write more longhand when you're there and then you transfer it to Scrivener? How does that work?
Yeah, so the longhand comes after I've done the outline. The
Okay.
outline is all on the computer. And then longhand comes when I'm doing like the individual chapters.
All your books like that, you write longhand and then transfer?
Pretty much. Yeah,
Oh.
pretty much. Like I'll write longhand for, an hour or two,
Hmm.
and then I'll transfer. Like so it's not like I write the whole book out longhand and then I transfer. I'll
Right.
write like a chapter out and then transfer. And I find that there's something about it that like longhand for me taps into the emotions
Hmm.
better.
Yeah.
And I find that's when like, particularly if the characters are like, if there's like heightened emotion, like that all comes out really quickly with longhand. And then when I transfer it onto the computer, that's when I'm going into like the logistics of the scene and the sort of setting the stage kind of where are we? What are we looking at? All of that comes after
Right.
I've got the longhand kind of emotion and action and pacing.
And in the
Mhm.
transcribing, it's kind of like you're editing, sort of, in a way. You can see the
Yeah.
holes. So I think that's a really smart way to do it. I read somewhere that writing, because I mean, you still have an instrument, you have a pen, but it's going right from your brain through your arm, your hand to the page versus the blunt instrument of the computer. That's actually how you should be writing all stories, going back to kind of like when Ernest Hemingway and all of them. I guess they had typewriters though.
They had typewriters, but I mean, the difference between a computer and a typewriter is a computer, yes, you have the same instrument as a typewriter, but you don't have with a typewriter, you don't have the distraction.
Oh
And
yeah.
that's what kills me on the computer is like I'll be typing something down and then, oh, what's going on here? Ooh, something happened. Ooh, Meghan Markle said something like, ooh, ooh, ooh. And so, or like I got a notification on Instagram or Twitter or whatever. There's so many distractions I find, and I'm not one of those people that can like put it in focus mode. It doesn't work for me.
No,
I
because you know
then I
you can
get
just take it out of focus mode.
because you can take it out.
Hmm.
So I'd rather like just shut the computers, go longhand, focus for that, and then yeah, sort of the pressure is off when I'm transcribing.
I really like that. I've always said I wanted to write an entire book just on the typewriter because it calibrates your brain to actually the way you think. With the computer, we're getting so much stimuli from all of the
Yeah.
pixels and everything. But a typewriter, your brain slows down, kind of like writing longhand, and you are typing at the speed at which you think, which is a better way to go. It would take a lot longer to write an entire book. Maybe it's just this romantic notion that I have,
Well,
but
you don't want that whole like Colin Firth in Love Actually moment where the pages go fluttering off
yeah, that would
the
happen to me.
stack. Oh, that would just kill me.
Yeah, or I read Ernest Hemingway. He left two manuscripts on a train and never got them back because he had typed them out. They were just fully done, ready. He was bringing them. I think he was probably drunk. He was always kind of
Yeah,
three
let's
sheets
be
to the
serious. It's
wind.
Ernest.
And he stumbled off the train after being on and left his suitcase with, he was bringing them to his editor and he left them. And he had, you don't have backup in those times and with his typewriter. So I always think of that too.
What happened to those manuscripts?
I
That
know.
is a book.
I know. I read that a biography about him or someone else's biography who was adjacent to him. Anyway, and you've inspired me now. You inspired me to get on Scrivener, and I think I got to start writing more longhand and get into that kind of
Well, anytime
emotional.
you want to go to my favorite like fountain pen store,
What is it? What's your
I will
favorite fountain?
take you.
What's it called?
Lay Wines in Yorkville, in
Ooh,
Toronto.
insider tip.
It is like Ollivander's wand shop. It is the greatest store for like writers, for stationery heads. Like it's just amazing.
Okay, I haven't been there. I've gone to all of the bookstores. There's over 50 bookshops in Toronto, by the way, but I have not been
I know.
to.
I love your bookshop, the bookshop passport.
Oh, thank
Yeah.
you. This is an aside, but I'm making passport kits. I got stamps developed, so you can sell it as
Stop.
like a little kit. Yeah. But the stationery store, also is your favorite pen? I love hearing writers' favorite writing
Oh,
tools.
Caron Dash is like one of my current favorites.
Okay.
So they have, it's a very affordable pen as far as fountain pens go. It's still like stonkingly expensive compared to like a ballpoint. But it's called a Caron Dash. It is just like a beautiful little,
Oh, that is
like
nice.
perfect. It's got like a hexagonal body, so it's like really nice to hold, and it's light and it's long. And so that's like my writing pen. And then my editing pen is a Quaco Sport.
Love it.
Yeah, which like twists off. It's beautiful. I mean, I've actually got two Quaco Sports right now and two Caron Dashes. And then I have at my house, it's like a cigar humidor box. That's what it looks like. And it's got all my really fancy pens in it.
Ooh, do you bring those to signings?
I actually, so it's funny you say that. I haven't ever brought them to signings, but I'm like, why don't I bring them to signings?
It's
So
like the nice china. You don't want to use it, but then it's like, no, I should use it on a more daily basis.
I know. So I feel like I feel like I'm going to go get an ink that like matches the cover of the Berlin apartment
Yeah,
and bring one of my like really, really fancy fountain pens to the book launch. And that's what I'll use to sign.
do it.
I
Yeah.
always
I
use
mean,
a Sharpie. It's not
Sharpies
as fun.
sometimes bleed through, not always, but they're just,
Oh, yeah.
it's
I
more
mean, fountain pens
fun.
will bleed through too, but you
True,
know,
that's true. But they're more fun to sign with, like you said.
oh, way more fun.
Like Jeff is obsessed, my husband, with knives and Japanese knives and all of these things.
Mm,
And he says my equivalent is fountain pens. So I share your affinity, but now I gotta go out and buy some of those.
yeah. Oh my gosh. I love chef's knives too. My sister's a chef. And so she got me on the fancy knives, and I've got a long list of those I want to.
We got to shout out actually your sister's bakery. If you're in Kitchener-Waterloo, go
Yes.
to Rue.
Go to Rue
ROUX.
Bakehouse on Belmont Street. It is incredible. It's a sourdough bakery, and her croissants are the best thing I've ever eaten.
They're sold out though, so go early. I mean, she sells out of some of
Yes.
her pastries, right? So
They sell out quick.
yeah, a multi-talented family in the Turnbull household. Do you have any other dream historical periods that you would love to write about in the future?
I do. I would love to do like Laurel Canyon, 1970s, like the golden age of music in Laurel Canyon.
Yeah.
I have a story idea that's been like percolating in that part of the world.
Is that
Um,
one of the two that you're currently
no,
juggling? No, okay.
no, I'm actually, so the ones that I'm juggling right now, one is my first rom-com, actually. It's my first contemporary book. It's a rom-com.
Ooh, wow, I'm
Um,
really excited. This is gonna be huge.
it's going to be fun. It's going to be fun. So that's one. And then the other is a historical fiction actually set up in cottage country.
Oh, how perfect. Then you have to just stay
Yeah.
at you have to winterize your cottage so you can be there to write all the time.
I know, exactly.
Well, I'm excited for both of those. Well, all three of those. After the launch next week, how are you going to celebrate the launch yourself? Are you going to go out for dinner? Are you going to treat yourself to something?
So the thing that I do with all of my books is I buy myself a ring.
Love that.
Yeah.
Love
Yeah.
that.
So I've got I buy, they're basically stacking rings.
Yep.
And so this book I've got to get my ring for this one.
Do they match the covers?
Yes,
Oh,
they do.
that's
So the first
lovely.
one was emeralds, the second is diamonds, third is rubies, fourth is going to be sapphires.
Oh, I really love that. And then
Yeah.
what's on the docket kind of now for the launch of the Berlin apartment?
Yeah, I've got a few things that are kind of coming down the pipeline. A few are still kind of in, in finalization mode, but I will be at the Grimsby Authors Festival in November, and I'm going to be doing a books and brunch in Burlington, with a different drummer bookshop. So those
Oh,
two are like definites. And then there are a few more things that'll be coming down the pipeline. I'll be sharing all of that on my Instagram, on my webpage. Yeah.
perfect. So where can everyone find you so they can follow along and see as it's updated all the events?
Yeah. So I post most regularly on Instagram. I'm at Bryn Turnbull Writes. And then my website is brynturnbull.com.
Perfect. And you can listen to Context with Bryn Turnbull, subscribe,
Mhm.
follow her new podcast, which is amazing.
You can indeed. Sorry, by the way, there's been a fly that's been buzzing around and I keep seeing it. Cottage living.
Don't worry, I didn't notice it. Well, I'll just think when I go back to edit this episode that you have like a little tick or something. It adds to the cottage atmosphere, though. I like it.
It really does.
Well, Bryn, thank you so much for taking the time. And everyone, please go pre-order The Berlin Apartment. You can get all of her books as well, from Woman Before Wallace, The Last Grand Duchess, to The Berlin Apartment, and of course, The Paris Deception right before that. But Bryn, I just love chatting with you and online and offline.
Oh, likewise, likewise. Lovely chatting with you. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Bye.